Good evening. Count von Bolt here. It is the 31st of October, Halloween, and I am here in my stately home of Birmingham. With it being this most auspicious of days, or rather nights, I thought I would regale you with some stories from across the water and closer to home. After all, both the old and the new world have given us such much vaunted ghost stories. America has given us such great classic horrors, such as Paris Hilton and the Twilight Saga. But for this story, I thought I would concentrate on one of its most famous places, the prison of Alcatraz in the San Francisco Bay. Alcatraz did not start off as a prison. Even before the white Europeans began building upon it, it was considered to be an evil place, avoided by the Native Americans. Should have sent Jacob there. Anyway, it was not until the 1930s, during the social upheaval brought about by Edgar Hoover and the Prohibition laws, that Alcatraz became a civilian prison. It was designed to be as brutal and as cruel as possible. Even those who could escape its impenetrable walls froze to death in the unforgiving waters of the bay. The first prisoners arrived in 1934, receiving numbers 1 to 32. The first prisoner of Alcatraz in this, under the Federal Bureau of Prisons, was a man named Frank Bolt. His crime? Sodomy. Hardly a violation of human rights. Guards were armed with machine guns, ensuring there was no escapes. Many convicts found Alcatraz the end of their career in crime, for the simple fact that it was the end of their lives. For 29 years, the fog-enshrouded island, with its cold, damp winds and isolation, made Alcatraz one of America's safest prisons. The shell of steel and concrete confined ruthless men to a life of deprivation, rules and routines that proved almost intolerable. When one adds the fact that convicts could hear party boats pass by and see the San Francisco city lights, it is little wonder that some preferred death to this kind of isolation. Even in Alcatraz there was worse than just looking out, though. There was the infamous D-Block, the treatment unit. Here men would leave their 4 by 8 foot cells only once in 7 days for a brief 10-minute shower. Life was hard on Alcatraz, the way it had been planned. There were, of course, escape attempts. But the bloodiest occurred on May the 6th, 1946, May the 2nd, 1946, involving Bernard Coy, Joseph Kretzer, Sam Shockley, Clarence Carnes, Marvin Hubbard, and Mirren Thompson. It cost the lives of 3 inmates and 2 guards, with 17 guards and 1 prisoner wounded. The trial afterwards resulted in the execution of 2 more convicts who took part in the aborted escape attempt. The reputation of Alcatraz, like the solid ground it was built on, represents a lasting reminder that no man is above the law. Its most famous inmate was of course Al Capone. During a sightings visit in 1922, several of the park's service staff confirmed the haunted history of Alcatraz. Many rangers had experienced inexplicable crashing sounds, cell doors mysteriously closing, unearthly screams and intense feelings of being watched. Sightings called on psychic investigator Peter James to walk through portions of the abandoned prison to get his impressions. James began to pick up the voices of the tortured souls, driven mad since its inception as a prison. He also sensed unusual vibrations of abuse, mistreatment, fear and pain. His overall impression of Alcatraz was that it had an energy like no other he had ever experienced. A persistent and overwhelming intensity that engulfed the island. Some of the more haunted locations on Alcatraz appear to be the warden's house, the hospital, the laundry room, and cell block C utility door, where convicts Coy, Kretzer, and Hubbard died during their escape attempt in 1946. The most haunted area in Alcatraz is the D cell block, or solitary as it was often called. To most who go there, a feeling of sudden intensity pervades the cells and corridor. Some rangers refuse to go there alone. It is intensely cold in certain cells, far colder than normal, even for cells of stone steel with no heating. Especially cell 14D. The cell is oftentimes so cold that wearing a jacket hardly helps, even though surrounding areas are 20 degrees warmer. It is known as the Hole, a psychic cold spot. When certain authors visited Alcatraz, namely Richard Weiner and Nancy Osborne, they ventured down to Solitary with a park ranger. As Osborne entered a cell 14D, she immediately felt strange vibrations coming within. Weiner and the ranger followed Osborne. Within seconds, each of them experienced an intense tingling sensation in their hands and arms. They were convinced that something, or someone, was standing in there with them. The far corner of the cell where they were standing and feeling the intense energy, where this was the exact spot where the naked, shivering prisoners would huddle night after night in the unforgiving darkness. Osborne said that she had never felt so much energy before in one spot. A former guard related his stories regarding cell block D and the frightening remnant energy lingering in the subterranean portion of the prison. During his stint in the mid-1940s, convicts were also often confined in one of the 14 cells in the D block, the Hole. The guard told a story of how one night an inmate was locked in. Within seconds, the inmate began screaming that someone with glowing eyes was in there with him. Tales of a ghostly presence wandering the darkened corridors in clothing from the late 1800s were a continual source of practical jokes amongst the guards, so the convicts' pleas of being attacked were ignored. The man's screaming continued well into the night, until there was silence, utter silence. The following day the guards inspected the cell. The convict was dead, a horrible expression etched on his face, and noticeable hand marks around his throat. The autopsy revealed the strangulation was not self-inflicted. Some say he was strangled by a guard who had enough of the man's screaming, though no guard had ever admitted it, even to the other guards. Others believe it was the restless, evil spirit of a former inmate who exacted his revenge on yet another helpless soul. To add to the mystery, the next day, several guards performing a routine line of convicts counted one too many people. At the end of the line, the guards witnessed an extra body, that of the recently deceased convict. As everyone looked in on stunned silence, the figure of the convict vanished into the thin air. A number of guards from 1946 through to 1963 also experienced other hauntings, but nothing as malevolent as the glowing-eyed demon. There was the sounds of people crying, moaning. There was foul smells, cold spots, and even on occasion seeing the thing with glowing eyes. Even guests have reported groups of phantom guards, prisoners and soldiers just appearing within their midst. Sometimes the old lighthouse appeared out of a dense fog, accompanied by a ghostly whistling sound and a great flashing light which passed slowly around the entire island, as if the lighthouse itself was still active. Phantom noises, gunshots, cannon shots and screams had often sent the guards racing to the floor, thinking the prisoners had escaped. One of the rooms in the laundry area would sometimes emanate a strong smell of smoke as if something was on fire. The sensation of smoke would drive the guards out the room, only for them to return a few minutes later, completely smoke-free. Even Warden Johnston, who didn't believe in ghosts, encountered the unmistakable sounds of a woman crying, as if coming from inside the walls of the dungeon. In 1940, several guards witnessed the chilling apparition of a man wearing a grey suit, brim cap, and mutton chop sideburns. When the men saw the apparition, the room turned deathly cold. The fire in the Brent Franklin stove was extinguished, and less than a minute afterwards the man vanished. This was in the warden's house, of what is now only a burnt-out shell. This is by far not an exhaustive account of the prison of Alcatraz itself. Alcatraz has long been known as one of the vilest institutions in the world. The old world, that of Great Britain, United Kingdom, has more than its fair share of ghost stories. With its deep Celtic lore, that's hardly a surprise. And though such great stories as Cuchulainn and Finn McCool do not reach its shores, it has its own tales. Like my recollection of Alcatraz, I will focus on a famous place in the UK, the Tower of London. The Wakefield Tower is haunted by the most tragic of English monarchs, Henry VI, whose weak and ineffectual reign ended in his murder on the 21st of May in 1471. He was kneeling in prayer at the time. His murderer was apparently the Duke of Gloucester. On the anniversary of his murder, Henry's mournful rage is said to appear as the clock ticks towards midnight, and pace fitfully around the interior of Wakefield Tower, until, upon the last stroke of midnight, he fades slowly into the stone, to rest for another year. The White Tower is one of the most eerie and almost certainly the most famous of all the Tower of London's buildings, and its winding stone corridors are the eerie haunt of a white lady, a traditional English ghost, who once stood at a window waving to a group of children in the building opposite. It may well be her cheap perfume that impregnates the air around the entrance of St. John's Chapel, which has caused many a guard to retch upon inhaling its pungent aroma. In the gallery where Henry VIII's impressive and exaggerating suit of armour is exhibited, several guards have spoken of a terrible crushing sensation that suddenly descends upon them as they enter, but which lifts when they leave. A guard patrolling through here once during the night got the sudden and unnerving sensation that somebody had thrown a heavy cloak over him. As he struggled to free himself, the garment was seized from behind and pulled tight around his throat by his phantom attacker. Managing to break free from his sinister grasp, he rushed back to the guard room, where the marks upon his neck bore vivid testimony to his attack. A memorial on Tower Green remembers all those unfortunate souls who have been executed here over the centuries. Both Anne Boleyn and the Lady Jane Grey are said to return to the vicinity, while the ghost of Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, returns here in a dramatic and alarming fashion. At the age of 72, she became an unwitting and undeserving target for Henry VIII's petty vengeance. Her son, Cardinal Pole, had defiled the king's claim as head of the Church of England. But he was safely installed in France, and so Henry had his mother brought to the block on the 27th of May, 1541. When told by the executioner to kneel, the old lady refused. "So should traitors do, and I am none," she sneered. The executioner raised his axe, took a swing at her, and then chased the screaming countess round the scaffold, where he literally hacked her to death. The shameful spectacle had been repeated many times, as her screaming phantom continues to be chased throughout eternity by a ghostly executioner. The Bloody Tower, which its very name conjures up all manner of gruesome images. is home to the most poignant of shades. Edward IV, who died suddenly in April 43. His 12-year-old son was destined to succeed him as Edward V. However, before his coronation could take place, both he and his younger brother Richard had been declared illegitimate by Parliament, and it was their uncle, the Duke of Gloucester, who ascended the throne as Richard III. The boys, meanwhile, had been sent to the Tower of London, supposedly for Edward's coronation, and they were often seen playing happily around the grounds. But then around June in 1483 they mysteriously vanished, and they were never seen alive again. It was as always assumed that they had been murdered on Richard's instructions and their bodies buried somewhere within the grounds of the tower. When two skeletons were uncovered beneath the staircase of the White Tower in 1674, nearly 200 years later, they were presumed to be the remains of the two little princes and afforded royal burial in Westminster Abbey. The wraiths of two children dressed in white nightgowns and clutching each other in terror have frequently been seen in the dimly lit rooms of their imprisonment. Witnesses are moved to pity and long to reach out to them, but should they do so, the trembling revenants back slowly against the wall and fade into the fabric. One of the last stories returns itself to the White Tower and the custody guards who wander its interior in the dead of night. The story is of a Mr. Arthur Crick, deciding to take a quick rest as he made his rounds. Sitting on a ledge, he slipped off his right shoe and was in the process of massaging his foot, when a voice behind him whispered, "There's only you and I here." Mr. Arthur Crick was made of sterner stuff than many others, when he turned round and said, "Just let me get this bloody shoe on, and there'll be only you." Maybe he is so used to the stories of the supernatural that it simply does not bother him anymore. Who can say? I hope you've enjoyed these two tales, done for amusement, and, well, if they give you a mild thrill, then all the better. Hope you appreciate this, because it bloody hurts to talk with these things in. And though I'll never have the skills of Shang-Chi, I do like telling the odd story. But for now, this is Count Von Bolt signing off, saying au revoir, adios, auf Wiedersehen.